What if time was not something you could trust? Picture this, a world where the hours stretched and shrank like shadows at sunset, where the very rhythm of life depended on the whims of water dripping from a jar or the uncertain dance of sunlight across a sundial. Before the Renaissance, this was the chaotic reality of timekeeping, a reality that drove a handful of brilliant, obsessive inventors to the brink of madness in their quest to tame it. These were the clockmakers who saw time not as an unstoppable force but as a puzzle to be solved, a wild beast to be caged, and their story is one of genius, desperation, and the kind of stubborn ambition that changes the world. Think about the clocks we take for granted today, the precise, reliable heartbeat of gears and springs that keeps our lives on track. Now imagine standing in the workshop of one of these medieval visionaries, surrounded by contraptions that look more like alchemy than engineering, water wheels that freeze in winter, candles that burn unevenly, and towers of weighted ropes that tangle without warning. These were the tools of their trade, and yet, against all odds, they inched closer to the impossible. Some called them fools, others whispered they were tampering with forces beyond human understanding. But what if their so-called failures were actually the secret blueprint for everything that came after? This is the story of how time was won, not by a single eureka, a moment, but through centuries of trial, error, and sheer stubbornness. It's a tale of inventors who stared into the chaos and refused to blink, whose wildest contraptions, some ingenious, some comical, slowly unraveled the mystery of minutes and hours. And by the end, you'll see the clock on your wall not just as a tool, but as a triumph over the very nature of time itself. So let's step into their workshops, where madness and genius were often two sides of the same coin, and discover how these forgotten pioneers laid the groundwork for the modern world, one erratic tick at a time. The sun could vanish behind clouds, water might freeze in winter, even the steady drip of a water clock could falter if the vessel wasn't perfectly level. For centuries, these were the fragile tools humanity relied on to measure time until the restless minds of medieval Europe decided there had to be a better way. Imagine the audacity it took to look at something as vast and untouchable as time itself and say, "I can build a machine to trap it." That's exactly what those first clockmakers did, though their creations were far from the sleek timekeepers we know today. Picture a monstrous assembly of iron and wood groaning under its own weight, its gears grinding like a cart stuck in mud. Yet these clunky prototypes were nothing short of miraculous for their era. What drove these inventors wasn't just technical curiosity, it was necessity. As crowded cities buzzed with merchants, craftsmen, and laborers, the old ways of marking time became hopelessly inadequate. A sundial couldn't settle disputes over market hours. A candle's burn couldn't coordinate cathedral bells. Time had to become something everyone could agree on, something divorced from the whims of nature. So up went the first tower clocks, their iron hearts beating unevenly but persistently, their bells booming across rooftops to announce the hour to anyone within earshot. And who were the people behind these machines? Often monks or blacksmiths, tinkerers who blended faith and physics in equal measure. Some saw their work as holy, a way to mirror the divine order of the universe. Others were simply obsessed with solving the puzzle before them, losing sleep over escapements and counterweights. Their names are mostly lost to history, but their legacy is etched into every clock face. Because hidden in those early, clumsy designs was a revelation. Time wasn't just something that happened to people, it could be harnessed, divided, even owned. That idea would change the world far more than any of them could have guessed. perpetual motion. It was the holy grail of medieval clockmakers, a dream that consumed them. If they could just build a machine that never stopped, never needed winding, never faltered, then time itself would bend to their will. Think about the sheer optimism, or maybe the madness of that idea. These inventors weren't just tinkering with gears, they were chasing immortality in iron and brass. One particularly ambitious design featured a massive wheel driven by swinging hammers, its momentum theoretically sustaining itself forever. Another relied on carefully balanced mercury flasks, their shifting weight meant to keep the mechanism in eternal motion. Of course, none of these contraptions worked. Physics made sure of that, but the obsession wasn't just about practicality, it was philosophical. If time was infinite, shouldn't its keeper be infinite too? The irony is delicious. These clockmakers, striving to create machines that defied entropy, were themselves racing against time. Some spent decades refining a single mechanism, only to watch it grind to a halt the moment they looked away. Others grew so fixated on their designs that they neglected sleep, food, even their families. There's a story, likely exaggerated but telling, of one inventor who starved to death in his workshop, convinced he was days away from unlocking the secret. And yet, for all their failures, these perpetual motion seekers stumbled into something far more valuable: precision. Every overcomplicated wheel, every futile attempt to cheat friction, slowly revealed the principles that would eventually lead to reliable escapements and regulated weights. What's fascinating is how close they came while missing the point entirely. A true perpetual motion machine is impossible, but their flawed attempts forced them to confront the real enemy, inconsistency. A clock that loses an hour a day is useless whether it stops or not. So, bit by bit, they shifted focus from eternal motion to dependable motion, the mercury flasks that couldn't sustain a wheel forever. They became the inspiration for fluid-based regulators, the self-defeating hammer mechanisms. They hinted at the importance of balanced force. Even their wildest dreams served a purpose. By aiming for the impossible, they accidentally engineered the practical. And let's not forget the mystics among them, who saw these machines as more than tools. To some, a perfect clock wasn't just a device but a mirror of God's universe, a tiny, ticking cosmos where order triumphed over chaos. That spiritual drive might explain why they kept at it despite the absurd odds. After all, if you're trying to replicate divine perfection, failure isn't just disappointing, it's heresy. So they filed, tweaked, and prayed, their workshops becoming temples to an idea both beautiful and futile. Yet from that fervor came a lesson even they couldn't have predicted. Sometimes the pursuit of an unattainable ideal leads you straight to the thing you actually need. The quest to trap time didn't give them immortality, but it did give the world something just as precious: the ability to measure life's fleeting moments with something sturdier than sunlight or candle wax. Astronomical clocks weren't just timekeepers, they were entire universes in miniature, where gears mimicked the dance of planets and painted saints marked the hours like celestial gatekeepers. Take the Prague astronomical clock, with its parade of apostles and a skeletal figure ringing the bell of mortality. This wasn't just engineering, it was theater, philosophy, and cosmology welded into one towering masterpiece. To build such a device, a clockmaker had to be part mathematician, part blacksmith, and part poet, translating the mysteries of the heavens into the clatter of escapements and chains. What's astonishing isn't just their complexity, but why anyone would attempt them in an era when even basic clocks were unreliable novelties. The answer lies in the medieval mind's hunger for connection between earth and sky, the divine and the mechanical. These clocks didn't merely tell time, they revealed humanity's place in a grand cosmic order. When the moon phase dial turned or the zodiac ring shifted, it wasn't just a display. It was a reassurance that the universe followed rules and that humans, through enough ingenuity, could decode them. Consider the star charts painstakingly engraved into brass plates, accurate enough to predict eclipses decades in advance. Or the mechanical procession of saints, timed to appear at canonical hours as if heaven itself kept schedule. Every detail served dual purposes: practical timekeeping and profound symbolism. The clockmakers who designed these marvels weren't just technicians. They were storytellers, using cogs and levers to narrate humanity's relationship with eternity. Yet behind the artistry lay grueling technical battles. Without telescopes or precise measuring tools, these craftsmen reverse-engineered celestial motions using naked eye observations and inherited Greek astronomy, often flawed by centuries of copying errors. Gears had to account for elliptical orbits before Kepler explained them. Moon phases required gear ratios so precise that a single tooth miscalculation could throw off the display by days within months. Some clocks compensated by incorporating adjustable mechanisms. A medieval version of software updates turned this dial to recalibrate after a cloudy week obscured observations. The legacy of these clocks rippled far beyond their towers. When Galileo studied pendulum motion or Newton formulated his laws, they stood on the shoulders of these obsessive tinkerers who first dared to mechanize the cosmos. The very idea that natural phenomena could be predicted and thus controlled by machinery seeded the scientific revolution. Those whirling zodiac rings and planetary disks were early blueprints for a radical thought. If the universe runs like clockwork, perhaps we can understand its workings. And then there's the sheer audacity of maintenance. Imagine being the caretaker of such a device, climbing into its wooden belly to oil gears worn thin by centuries of use, knowing one misadjusted weight could silence its celestial choir forever. Some clocks survived wars, fires, and neglect, only to be repaired into dysfunction by later generations who'd lost the original maker's intuition. The Strasbourg clock, for instance, was rebuilt 3 times over 600 years, each iteration a palimpsest of changing technology and forgotten craftsmanship. Perhaps that's the real magic of these machines. They weren't just products of their time, they transcended it, bridging medieval wonder and modern precision. Every astronomical dial, every animated figurine whispered the same tantalizing promise: time and space aren't chaos to endure, but puzzles to solve. And in that promise lay the spark that would eventually ignite the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, and our own age of atomic clocks and space telescopes. The true time these clocks measured wasn't in hours, but in centuries, the slow, inevitable tick of human curiosity, advancing one intricate gear at a time. Monasteries didn't just keep time, they worshipped by it. Picture a Benedictine monk in the 14th century, rising in the dead of night to the sound of bells, his entire life measured out in sacred intervals: matins at midnight, lauds at dawn, vespers as the sun dipped below the cloister walls. Before mechanical clocks, these rituals relied on water clocks or star observations, but nature was a fickle timekeeper. A cloudy night could throw the monastery into chaos, leaving monks groggy from interrupted sleep or scrambling to make up missed prayers. That's why monasteries became the unlikely cradle of clockmaking, where faith met gears in a desperate bid for precision. The collaboration between monks and clockmakers was a meeting of minds as much as skills. Monastic life demanded regimentation, a strict division of hours that mirrored the celestial order they believed God had woven into creation. To them, a well-regulated clock wasn't just a tool. It was a hymn written in brass and iron, a way to sync human routines with the eternal rhythm of the divine. Some monks, trained in metalwork or mathematics, even designed their own mechanisms, tweaking escapements to better align with liturgical needs. Others funded craftsmen, offering shelter and patronage in exchange for clocks that could withstand the demands of round-the-clock prayer cycles. Consider the Wells Cathedral clock, built in the late 14th century with a face that still marks the hours today. Its original purpose, to ensure monks didn't miss the canonical hours, the 8 daily prayer sessions that structured monastic life. But here's the twist: the clock didn't just chime, it jousted. Every hour, a miniature knight on horseback tilts at a rival, a whimsical yet profound reminder that time itself was a battlefield between order and chaos. That blend of piety and engineering captures the medieval mindset perfectly. Even their clocks were sermons. Beyond practicality, this partnership reveals a radical idea taking root: that humans could and should impose order on time. Ancient civilizations had treated time as a force to observe, like the turning seasons or the Nile's floods. But medieval monks saw it as something to actively shape, a divine mandate to number our days, as the Psalms said. Their clocks weren't just measuring devices, they were moral instruments reinforcing discipline, punctuality, and the virtue of routine. In an era when most peasants lived by the sun's vague arc, monasteries were islands of mechanical precision, their bells cutting through the fog of agrarian time like a knife. Yet for all their spiritual fervor, these monastic clocks were far from perfect. Early mechanisms might lose or gain an hour a day, forcing constant adjustments. Some relied on a verge and foliate escapement, a crude swinging bar that wobbled like a drunken pendulum, its accuracy at the mercy of friction and wear. But imperfection didn't deter them. Monks would rather reset a faulty clock hourly than return to candle marks or sundials, because even a flawed machine upheld their belief in a universe governed by divine law. The legacy of this fusion echoes in our modern world. The very word clock comes from the Latin clocca, meaning bell, a reminder of its monastic roots. And those rigid prayer schedules, they became the blueprint for factory whistles and school bells, the industrial world's inheritance from the cloister. The monks didn't just invent timekeeping, they invented the idea that time could be owned, divided, and optimized, a notion that would eventually fuel everything from railroad schedules to digital calendars. So the next time you glance at your phone for the time, spare a thought for those medieval monks, hunched over candlelit workbenches, filing gears to the sound of chanting. They weren't just building clocks, they were trying to build a bridge between heaven and earth, one tick at a time. The escapement was the unsung hero in the battle to trap time, a deceptively simple piece of engineering that turned erratic medieval clocks into something resembling order. Picture a tiny lever dancing back and forth, catching and releasing a toothed wheel with rhythmic precision. This minuscule motion, often no larger than a child's finger, was the secret heartbeat that made mechanical timekeeping possible. But here's the twist: no one knows for certain who first dreamed it up. Some ancient texts hint at water-powered escapements in Tang Dynasty China, where floating scoops triggered gears to mark the hours. Others point to European monastic workshops, where sleep-deprived monks might have stumbled upon the idea while trying to synchronize prayer bells. The truth: it was probably reinvented multiple times, lost and found like a key that keeps slipping between floorboards. What made the escapement revolutionary wasn't just its mechanics, it was the philosophy behind it. Before this invention, clocks relied on continuous force, like flowing water or falling weights, which raced unchecked until they ran out. The escapement did something radical. It interrupted that force, parceling it into measured, equal beats. Think of it as a gatekeeper sternly dictating, "You shall not pass until I say so." This control transformed time from a blur into a series of discrete moments, each one as identical as the next. Suddenly, an hour in London could mean the same thing as an hour in Paris, at least in theory. Yet perfecting this mechanism took centuries of frustration. Early verge escapements were notoriously finicky, their foliate balance arms swaying like metronomes with a hangover. Changes in temperature warped the metal. Wear and tear introduced inconsistencies. A clock might gain 15 minutes on a humid day or lose half an hour if the lubricating oil thickened in winter. Clockmakers became part-time alchemists, experimenting with alloys, adjusting tooth angles, even praying over their creations like medieval tech support. The escapement wasn't just a component, it was a nemesis, always one wobble away from rebellion. Then came the pendulum. In the mid-17th century, Galileo's insight that a swinging weight could keep perfect rhythm gave escapements the partner they'd been missing. Now, instead of relying on crude foliates, clocks could harness the pendulum's natural regularity. The difference was like swapping a drunk messenger for a military courier. Suddenly, timekeeping accuracy leaped from good enough for monastery bells to capable of tracking longitude at sea. But even this breakthrough had medieval roots. Those clunky, unreliable verge escapements had laid the groundwork, proving that controlled release of energy was possible. Without their stubborn imperfections, no one would have known what to perfect. The escapement's legacy hides in plain sight today. Every quartz watch, every atomic clock still relies on its core principle, the disciplined release of energy in measured increments. Those medieval tinkerers, squinting at their grease-stained gears, were unknowingly inventing the pulse of modern life. Their struggle wasn't just about mechanics, it was about imposing human will on the universe's chaos. And in that sense, every time you check your phone or catch a train, you're living inside their centuries-old dream. A dream where time doesn't flow like a river but ticks like a clock. Clockmakers and alchemists shared more than just cluttered workshops, they shared a dream. To both, mercury wasn't just a metal, it was the liquid silver of transformation, capable of unlocking hidden truths. Some clockmakers filled their gear trains with it, believing its fluid perfection could mimic the elusive flow of time itself. Others crafted celestial orreries where rotating brass spheres traced planetary paths, not just as timekeeping aids but as attempts to recreate the cosmic dance in miniature. These weren't mere craftsmen, they were borderland thinkers straddling the line between mysticism and mechanics, convinced that mastering time required deciphering the universe's secret language. Take the case of Giovanni da Dondi, a 14th century physician-astronomer who spent 16 years building his astrarium, a clock so intricate it modeled the movements of the sun, moon, and 5 known planets. His notebooks reveal less an engineer's calculations than an alchemist's fervor, peppered with references to celestial harmonies and elemental balance. To da Dondi, each gear wasn't just a component, it was a planetary influence waiting to be harnessed. His workshop likely smelled of molten wax and quicksilver, the air thick with the same charged anticipation as an alchemist's laboratory. The difference, where alchemists sought gold, clockmakers sought precision, yet both believed perfection lay in uncovering nature's hidden symmetries. This fusion of disciplines wasn't coincidence, it was necessity. Before the scientific method crystallized, understanding the world meant blending observation with intuition. A clockmaker might adjust a gear ratio based on Ptolemaic astronomy one moment, then anoint the mechanism with consecrated oil the next. Mercury-driven escapements weren't just engineering experiments, they were echoes of alchemical belief that mercury embodied the volatile spirit of matter. Even the materials they used carried symbolic weight, brass for its celestial glow, iron for its earthly strength, glass for its purity. Every choice whispered a deeper question: if time governed life, could controlling it reveal life's essence? Yet for all their mystical trappings, these alchemist clockmakers stumbled into empirical truths. Their mercury clocks, though doomed by the metal's temperature sensitivity, proved that fluids could regulate motion, a principle later refined in marine chronometers. Their celestial models, however fanciful, demanded such precise gear ratios that they pushed mathematics forward. Even their failures were instructive. When a gear train jammed or a weight snapped its cable, it wasn't divine displeasure but physics asserting itself, quietly schooling them in the realities of friction and force. The irony is rich. While alchemy faded into obscurity, its clockmaking twin thrived not because it abandoned mysticism, but because it channeled that same boundless curiosity into tangible results. The Renaissance spirit didn't discard their esoteric dreams. It grounded them in gears and pendulums. By seeking to trap time in brass cages, these tinkerers unknowingly forged a new philosophy, that the universe's secrets might not lie in turning lead to gold, but in measuring the silent spaces between ticks. And in that shift, they became something even rarer than alchemists. They became the first true scientists. A tower clock wasn't just a timekeeper, it was a throne made of gears. When a medieval king or town council commissioned one, they weren't merely buying a machine, they were staging a coup against the sun itself. Imagine the shock of peasants who'd always measured their days by rooster crows and hunger pangs, suddenly hearing a mechanical bell slice the air with royal decree. This was power made audible, a proclamation that authority now governed not just land and taxes, but the very minutes of people's lives. The clock face looming over the town square became the ruler's face, its hands outstretched like scepters over the lives below. Not everyone bowed to this new order. In 14th century Lyon, riots erupted when the archbishop installed a public clock that disregarded local work customs, its bells overriding the natural rhythms of artisans and laborers. Similar rebellions flared across Europe wherever clocks disrupted traditional timekeeping. Fishermen resented being summoned to market by a machine rather than the tide. Farmers scoffed at planting schedules dictated by urban officials who'd never touched soil. Time had become contested territory, with rulers pulling it toward standardization while commoners clung to organic, task-based rhythms honed over generations. The stakes were higher than punctuality. Controlling time meant controlling productivity, worship, even dissent. When English King Edward III mandated uniform market hours across his realm in the 1300s, it wasn't just administrative efficiency, it was economic warfare against rival trade cities. A merchant forced to close his stall at the stroke of 4 lost business to competitors in towns with later hours. Meanwhile, church bells that once marked prayer times now dueled with secular clock towers, their competing chimes a sonic battlefield between spiritual and civic authority. Some rulers weaponized timekeeping outright. The Duke of Burgundy famously gifted neighboring towns with exquisitely inaccurate clocks, lavish diplomatic Trojan horses that threw local schedules into chaos. Other cities imposed curfews through clock mechanisms, physically locking gates when the hour struck, trapping enemies outside or dissidents within. The message was clear: whoever wound the clock ruled the day. Yet for all their imposing might, these early public clocks were fragile tyrants. Their mechanisms required constant maintenance by temperamental specialists who might secretly tweak the gears to favor certain guilds or delay unwanted royal proclamations. There are records of clockkeepers being bribed to lose time during disputes or hasten the hour when bribed by impatient merchants. Even the grandest tower clock could be undermined by a well-placed coin or a disgruntled artisan's wrench. This tension between centralized control and organic resistance shaped modernity itself. The factory whistle, the punch clock, the atomic time standard, all descend from those medieval battles over whose rhythm would govern society. What began as a squabble over bell towers became a quiet revolution in human consciousness. The realization that time isn't just something we inhabit, but something we negotiate, often with power dynamics ticking beneath the surface. The next time you check your watch without thinking, remember, that casual glance is the endpoint of a war waged in iron and shadow, where every tick carried the weight of who gets to decide when. Climbing the skeletal scaffolding of a half-built clock tower, a medieval craftsman knew each step might be his last. These structures weren't just tall, they were recklessly so, often erected without proper bracing, their wooden frames groaning under the weight of iron mechanisms that could crush a man like a beetle if a pulley snapped. Records from 15th century Strasbourg tell of a clockmaker who plunged 80 feet when a rotten beam gave way, his body landing among the gears he'd spent years perfecting. Another in Prague survived a fall, only to be crushed weeks later by a collapsing counterweight. Why would anyone take such risks? Because tower clocks weren't just machines, they were acts of defiance. Consider the physics of these behemoths. A single gear in the Wells Cathedral clock weighed over 500 pounds, its teeth painstakingly filed by hand. The driving weights alone required teams of oxen to haul into position, dangling on ropes that frayed with each passing season. And then there was the wind, an invisible enemy that could turn a tower into a swaying death trap. Clockmakers often worked in open belfries, their fingers numb from cold as they wrestled frozen gears, knowing one misstep could send them spinning into the square below. Yet they returned day after day, driven by something deeper than wages or fame. The contracts they signed reveal the peril. Many included clauses absolving the city if the craftsman died mid-construction, with payments doled out in stages, not just to ensure quality, but to compensate families if tragedy struck. In some towns, clockmakers demanded hazardous pay, their fees swelling with each additional foot of height. But the real motivation lay in the stakes. A successful tower clock didn't just tell time, it announced a city's sophistication to rivals, drawing merchants and pilgrims like a mechanical siren song. For the clockmaker, it was immortality cast in iron. Their name would ring out with every chime for centuries. Some builders turned their brushes with death into legend. The clockmaker of Rostock, after surviving a fall that left him bedridden for months, returned to install his masterpiece with a crutch in one hand and a hammer in the other. Others wove hidden safeguards into their designs, like the anonymous artisan who carved a prayer into the central gear of a Danish clock. God grant this holds. The most cunning used their near disasters as marketing. A clock in York was said to be blessed by the blood of its maker, a grisly guarantee of its durability. Yet the greatest danger wasn't the height or the weight, it was time itself. These projects dragged on for decades, consuming their creators' lives. The Strasbourg clock took 3 generations of craftsmen to complete, the original designer dying long before his sketches became reality. That was the cruelest irony. The very thing they sought to capture often outran them. But perhaps that's why they kept climbing. Every bolt tightened, every gear meshed, was a small victory over oblivion, proof that human hands could shape eternity, even if only for an hour at a time. Villard de Honnecourt's sketchbook reads like a fever dream of medieval engineering. A jumbled treasure trove where cathedral blueprints jostle against crude clock designs, all scribbled alongside notes that veer from practical geometry to outright fantasy. On one page, a meticulous gear train for a tower clock. On the next, a lion drawn from hearsay, its anatomy guessed at by an artist who'd never seen one. This is the maddening paradox of surviving clockmaker manuscripts. They're simultaneously precise and cryptic, offering just enough detail to tease what's been lost. Honnecourt's work survived by sheer luck. tucked away in a French monastery while countless others fed the flames of wars, purges, and simple neglect. The destruction of these texts wasn't always accidental. During the Reformation, many monastic workshops, the very heart of early clockmaking, were ransacked as symbols of Catholic excess. Manuscripts containing generations of horological knowledge burned alongside illuminated Bibles, their vellum pages curling into smoke. Other texts fell victim to trade secrecy. Guilds guarded their techniques like state secrets, encoding notes in ciphers or destroying them entirely to prevent rivals from stealing hard-won innovations. A clockmaker in Augsburg was said to have burned his life's work on his deathbed, preferring knowledge to die with him rather than risk it being misused. What makes these losses especially agonizing are the tantalizing hints left behind. A marginal note in a 15th century astronomical text mentions a self-correcting clock mechanism in Prague, one that could adjust for seasonal variations in day length. No such device survives, nor any detailed description. Another chronicle references a woman clockmaker in Bruges who devised a revolutionary escapement using silk threads, but her name and designs are lost. These fragments suggest a shadow history of horology, where breakthroughs were made and forgotten, only to be reinvented centuries later. Even surviving manuscripts pose riddles. The sketches often omit critical details, assuming contemporary readers would understand the context. A gear might be meticulously rendered while its mounting is just a vague squiggle, as if the maker thought, "Of course, everyone knows how this part works." Some designs are clearly theoretical, labeled experimentum in shaky Latin, leaving us to wonder whether they were ever built or if they failed catastrophically. And then there are the outright enigmas, like the Strasbourg clock plans that include a mysterious compartment labeled for the perpetual motion, its contents forever unknown. The greatest loss isn't just technical, it's human. Without personal writings, we can only guess at the frustrations and eurekas that filled these workshops. Did the clockmaker who designed the Wells Cathedral jousting knights laugh as he tested its motion? Did the artisan who carved prayer-filled gears weep when his first prototype shattered? These voices are silenced, leaving us with cold metal and cryptic sketches where there were once passions, jokes, and midnight oil burned in pursuit of the impossible. Yet in their absence, these lost manuscripts hold a peculiar power. They remind us that history isn't a straight line of progress, but a stuttering dance of discovery and oblivion. Every surviving clock tower stands atop a mountain of burnt parchment and broken prototypes, each tick a memorial to ideas we'll never hear. And perhaps that's the final lesson of these vanished texts, not just how much we've lost, but how much more there must have been to find. Becoming a clockmaker in medieval Europe wasn't just about learning gears, it was a trial by fire, secrecy, and sometimes literal blood oaths. Guild initiation rites read like something between a tradesman's exam and a secret society ritual. In Nuremberg, apprentices faced a grim test, reconstructing a dismantled clock mechanism blindfolded, their fingers tracing gear teeth like braille while masters whispered misleading hints. Succeed, and you earn the right to wear the guild's silver pin. Fail, and you might find yourself barred from every workshop in the city. This wasn't just hazing, it was a brutal filter to ensure only the most determined, dexterous minds could join the inner circle. The guild's obsession with secrecy went far beyond trade rivalry. Manuscripts were written in cipher, with critical steps omitted or disguised. One surviving fragment from a 15th century French guild book describes an escapement mechanism as the dance of the seven veils, followed by a recipe for goose fat lubricant written in reverse Latin. Apprentices swore oaths on pain of excommunication never to reveal their master's techniques, some even pricking their thumbs to seal the vow in blood. This paranoia had roots in economics. A guild's monopoly depended on controlling knowledge, but also in something deeper. Clockmakers saw themselves as guardians of divine mysteries, their craft teetering between art and alchemy. Yet this secrecy came at a cost. When the Black Death wiped out entire guilds in the 1300s, techniques vanished overnight. A master might take his most innovative design to the grave, forcing the next generation to reinvent it decades later. The London Clockmakers Guild records lament the lost arts of Master Henrik, whose legendary self-winding mechanism was never documented, only demonstrated to initiates in candlelit cellars. Progress didn't advance in a straight line. It sputtered, backtracked, and occasionally leaped forward when a drunken apprentice spilled secrets at a tavern. The guild's greatest contradiction was how their elitism accidentally preserved craftsmanship. By restricting access, they ensured only those willing to spend years mastering fundamentals could innovate. Modern engineers examining medieval clock gears are often stunned by their precision, filed by hand to tolerances rivaling modern machinery. That quality came from guild-enforced standards. In some cities, a master's work had to run within 15 minutes per week or face public destruction. The threat of humiliation honed perfectionism sharper than any file, but not all knowledge stayed locked away. When war or famine scattered guild members, their secrets seeped into new territories. A fugitive clockmaker from Flanders might barter escape for teaching a Swiss village how to cast brass wheels. Some guilds even planted false initiates, members sent to rival cities with deliberate flaws in their training, sabotaging competitors' clocks with subtle errors. The Strasbourg Guild was notorious for this, their spies reportedly causing a catastrophic bell tower collapse in Mainz by misaligning a single counterweight. What's fascinating is how these closed networks shape technology's spread. Unlike the printing press or windmill, clocks didn't diffuse evenly across Europe. They erupted in clusters where guilds flourished, leaving vast horological deserts between them. A town 30 miles from Prague might still be using sundials decades after its neighbor installed a mechanical marvel, simply because no guild member ever crossed its borders. This patchwork advancement created bizarre timekeeping disparities. Two nearby monasteries might disagree on the hour by half a day, each convinced their guild-sanctioned clock was infallible. The guild's legacy lingers in unexpected places. Modern patent laws echo their protective instincts, while the apprentice journeyman master system survives in some European trades. Even our romantic image of the lone inventor tinkering in secrecy owes something to those medieval workshops where knowledge was both weapon and treasure. In the end, their greatest creation wasn't any single clock. It was the very idea that technological progress could be owned, controlled, and fought over. A notion that, much like their finest timepieces, just keeps ticking through the centuries. The idea of carrying time in your pocket seems so natural now, but 500 years ago, it was pure alchemy. Before the familiar pocket watch, there were curious contraptions. Spring-driven table clocks small enough to hide in a cupboard, ornate sundials worn as pendants, even cylindrical clock canes that chimed the hour with each step. These weren't just prototypes, they were declarations that timekeeping could break free from towers and monastery walls. Yet shrinking a clock into something wearable took more than ingenuity. It required rewriting the rules of mechanics, metallurgy, and even human ambition. Take Peter Henlein, the Nuremberg locksmith often credited with inventing the first watch around 1510. Legend paints him as a reclusive genius, tinkering in secret after dark to avoid guild restrictions. But the truth is messier. Henlines, Nuremberg eggs, oval brass cases barely 3 inches wide weren't true watches by modern standards. Their primitive verge escapements lost hours each day, and they lacked minute hands entirely. What made them revolutionary wasn't precision, but portability. For the first time, wealthy merchants could pull time from their doublets like a secret, glancing at its trembling hands during negotiations to signal they had places to be. But Henline had rivals. In Florence, a shadowy figure known only as Julian the Turk was crafting spring-driven timepieces for Medici princes, their mechanisms so delicate they required gold alloys to prevent rust. Meanwhile, French clockmakers accused Henline of stealing their coil spring designs, sparking a cross-border feud that played out in coded letters and sabotaged shipments. This wasn't just competition, it was industrial espionage in an age when every gear tooth was a trade secret worth poisoning over. The real bottleneck wasn't creativity, but physics. Miniaturizing a tower clock's components introduced problems no one anticipated. Tiny gears wore out faster, springs lost tension unpredictably. Even temperature changes wreaked havoc. A watch carried next to the body would expand slightly from body heat, throwing off its timing. Solving these issues demanded advances in multiple fields: precise screw-cutting lathes, temperature-resistant alloys, even the invention of the balance spring by Christian Huygens in the 1600s. Each breakthrough came from a different corner of Europe, passed hand to hand through networks of artisans who often didn't realize they were contributing to horology's greatest revolution. Yet the delay wasn't just technical, it was cultural. For centuries, time had been communal, its rhythms shared through church bells and town criers. The idea that individuals might each carry their own personal version of time seemed absurd, even dangerous. Early watch owners faced suspicion. Some were accused of witchcraft for trapping hours in metal. It took the rising merchant class, with their need to coordinate shipments and meetings across cities, to create demand for portable timekeeping. Watches became status symbols, their accuracy secondary to their artistry. One 16th century piece featured a tiny cannon that fired a spark at noon, igniting a pinch of gunpowder on its lid. The evolution from Henline's eggs to the pocket watch mirrored a broader shift in human thought. As timekeeping moved from public squares to private pockets, so too did the concept of time itself, from something imposed by authority to something owned, controlled, even wasted. Those early watchmakers didn't just invent a device, they helped invent modernity's most precious commodity, personal time. And in doing so, they gave every wearer a silent, ticking reminder of life's most unsettling truth: that time waits for no one, but now at least you could keep it close. The Black Death didn't just empty villages, it shattered the very rhythm of medieval life. With nearly half of Europe's population wiped out in the mid-14th century, the survivors faced a world where time itself seemed broken. Fields lay fallow because there were no hands to sow them. Church bells tolled endlessly for the dead, their chimes no longer marking prayers but counting losses. And yet, in this chaos, an unexpected shift occurred. The scarcity of labor made human time suddenly valuable. Monks who once measured hours by psalms now needed machines to fill the gaps left by vanished brethren. Blacksmiths, their ranks thinned by plague, turned from horseshoes to forging clock components, realizing that automation could compensate for missing workers. The very catastrophe that seemed to halt progress became the unlikely engine of horology's leap forward. Look at the church records from this period, and you'll find a curious pattern. Monasteries that had relied on water clocks or candle timers began commissioning mechanical clocks in the decades after the plague. Why? Because the meticulous schedule of prayers, the opus dei that structured monastic life, couldn't be maintained when half the choir had succumbed to fever. A clock didn't get sick, it didn't mourn, It simply ticked, offering a semblance of order when the world felt unmoored. The clock at St. Albans Abbey, installed in the 1360s, was explicitly described as a solace for our diminished brethren to keep faith when flesh fails. But the plague's impact wasn't just spiritual, it was economic. With fewer workers, those who survived could demand higher wages, and suddenly, tracking labor hours became crucial. Towns like Bruges and Ghent saw the first recorded use of public clocks to regulate work shifts, their bells cutting through the fog of grief to impose a new discipline. Employers who once paid by the task now needed to account for time itself, leading to contracts specifying 4 hours at the loom or 6 hours at the forge. The clock, once a luxury for cathedrals, became a tool of commerce, its gears greased by desperation. The psychological effect was profound. In a world where death had felt random and capricious, the clock's steady rhythm offered an illusion of control. Art from the period shows clocks appearing in plague paintings, often hovering above scenes of devastation like silent witnesses. Some bore morbid inscriptions, "I count the hours, not the dead," while others were adorned with symbols of resurrection, their hands pointing toward a future where time might once again mean something other than loss. And then there were the innovations born of sheer necessity. With guilds decimated, the strict rules guarding clockmaking secrets began to crumble. Apprentices became masters overnight, experimenting with designs their mentors would have rejected. The weight-driven clocks of pre-plague Europe, which required constant winding by teams of monks, gave way to spring-driven prototypes as craftsmen sought ways to reduce human labor. Even the materials changed. Shortages of traditional metals led to experiments with alloys that would later prove crucial for portable timepieces. Perhaps the most poignant legacy of this era lies in the town squares of Germany and Flanders, where surviving citizens pooled their resources to erect clocks not just as utilities but as memorials. The Lübeck astronomical clock, completed in 1405, featured a procession of carved saints, a roll call of the plague's victims, forever circling the face of time. Every hour, their tiny figures emerged from behind the dial, a mechanical memento mori that turned grief into motion. The paradox is striking. The same catastrophe that made life feel fleeting and fragile also pushed humanity to grasp time more tightly, to quantify it, mechanize it, and ultimately to master it. When the world seemed to be ending, the clockmakers' answer wasn't to surrender to chaos, but to build something that outlasted it. Their creations became more than machines. They were acts of defiance, each tick a whisper against the silence of the grave. And in that defiance, they laid the groundwork for a revolution, not just in timekeeping, but in how we measure what it means to be alive. The moon had always governed human lives long before clocks existed, dictating when to plant crops, when tides would rise, even when wolves might howl closest to village walls. So when medieval clockmakers began arguing over whether their machines should track lunar cycles alongside ours, it wasn't just a technical debate, it was a collision of worldviews. On one side stood the traditionalists, who insisted that any true measure of time must honor the moon's silver rhythms. Their clocks featured rotating discs painted with crescent and full moons, geared to sync with the celestial dance. To them, ignoring the moon was like building a sundial that only worked at noon, a hollow imitation of time's true nature. Opposing them were the modernists, who saw lunar complications as relics of superstition. A merchant in Florence didn't need to know the moon's phase to close a deal. A blacksmith didn't consult the tides to shoe a horse. As urban life accelerated, these pragmatists argued that timekeeping should serve human schedules, not celestial poetry. The Strasbourg clockmaker Isaac Habrecht spoke for many when he scoffed, "We build clocks to tame chaos, not worship it." His stripped-down designs prioritized reliability over astronomical flair, though rumors persisted that he secretly charted moon phases in his workshop ledger. The tension played out in fascinating ways. In 1424, the City Council of Lübeck commissioned a clock with dual faces, one showing conventional hours, the other tracking lunar months, only to abandon the moon dial within a decade when merchants complained it confused travelers. Meanwhile, monastic clockmakers clung stubbornly to lunar mechanisms, their intricate gears calculating Easter's movable feast dates with pious precision. The difference wasn't just functional, it was philosophical. Was time a web woven by God's heavens or a grid drawn by human hands? Some inventions tried to bridge the divide. The Prague astronomical clock famously married both visions, its golden moon sphere rotating to show phases while its central face kept earthly hours. But even this masterpiece sparked controversy. Astronomers accused its creator of sacrificing accuracy for spectacle, noting the moon mechanism drifted by a day every few years. The clock's keeper, a dour canon named Hanush, reportedly defended the drift as a reminder that only God is perfect, until legend claims he was blinded by the city council to prevent him from building a better version elsewhere. The lunar debate faded as clockmaking advanced, but its echoes linger. Today, watch enthusiasts still pay premium prices for moon phase complications, though few could explain their practical use. There's something primal in that lingering appeal, proof that even in our digitized age, part of us still craves timekeeping that acknowledges the night sky's ancient pull. The medieval clockmakers understood what we've since forgotten. That time isn't just something we measure, but something we feel, as surely as the tug of tides or the glow of a harvest moon. Their lunar wheels may have been imperfect, but they captured a truth no atomic clock ever will, that humans will always hunger for machines that whisper of mysteries beyond their gears. History remembers the names of male clockmakers like Peter Henlein and Giovanni da Dondi, but hidden in guild ledgers and workshop inventories are glimpses of women who shaped horology only to be erased by time. Take Margaret Skickart, a 16th century artisan whose delicate engravings adorn the gears of Black Forest clocks, or the unnamed clock wives of Augsburg, who kept workshops running while their husbands took public credit. Their stories aren't just footnotes, they're proof that the history of timekeeping has always had two hands. The obstacles these women faced weren't just societal, they were baked into the guild system itself. Most European clockmaking guilds barred women from formal apprenticeships, forcing them to learn through back channels. A daughter might study under her father, tracing gear designs by candlelight after official apprentices had left. Wives often handled intricate tasks like assembling verge escapements or polishing pinions, their contributions dismissed as assistants in official records. And widows, they were the industry's best-kept secret. When a master clockmaker died, his workshop frequently passed to his widow, not as an inheritance, but as a temporary custodian until she trained a male successor. Some, like Lyon's Catherine Jobbo, defied expectations by running workshops for decades, their craftsmanship indistinguishable from male peers, yet their exclusion wasn't universal. In convents, nuns like Hildegard of Bingen designed water clocks for liturgical use, their work celebrated as divine inspiration rather than technical skill. Noblewomen commissioned clocks as political statements. Isabella d'Este's famed celestial timepiece, with its silver moon phases, was a not-so-subtle nod to her astrological prowess. And in market towns, women often repaired household clocks, their names scrawled in account books beside entries for mending the town hall clock or adjusting the abbey's horologe. The evidence is there if you know where to look. The real tragedy isn't just that these women were forgotten, it's how their erasure distorted horology's evolution. Guilds dismissed feminine techniques like using silk threads for lubrication or wax molds for gear testing, only to later discover these methods as breakthroughs. The balance spring, crucial for accurate pocket watches, may have roots in the embroidery tension devices women invented for looms. Even early production lines mirrored the communal textile work women had mastered for centuries, yet clockmaking histories credit only the men who industrialized it. Rediscovering their legacy changes how we see the clocks themselves. That exquisite astronomical clock in Prague, its gilded stars were likely positioned by a workshop's unsung female artisans, their understanding of celestial navigation honed by stitching constellations into tapestries. The revolutionary stack-freed mechanism, which equalized a watch's power flow, its spiral shape echoes the precise tension control women achieved in lace-making. These weren't just borrowed ideas, they were the quiet genius of minds trained in craft society deemed lesser. Perhaps the most telling clue lies in what wasn't recorded. When guilds began systematically documenting designs in the 17th century, women's contributions vanished from technical manuals, yet their tools remained. Delicate pin vises identical to those used in gold thread embroidery appear in clockmakers' inventories. Tiny anvils for shaping gear teeth match those described in midwives' kits for crafting silver teething rings. The very language of horology carries their influence, the lantern pinion, resembling the handheld lights women carried through dark workshops, or the fusee chain, its loops mirroring the stitches of seamstresses. What does this mean for us today? It's more than correcting the historical record. It's recognizing that innovation has never flowed through a single pipeline. The next time you check your watch, remember, the precise, portable timekeeping we take for granted was shaped by countless hands, some holding files, some holding needles, all moving together in silent synchrony. And in that truth lies a lesson far more valuable than any clock could ever tell. To medieval philosophers, a ticking clock wasn't just a machine. It was the universe in miniature, its gears mirroring the celestial spheres they believed God had set in motion. When the 14th century scholar Nicole Orsme compared the cosmos to a vast clockwork, he wasn't speaking poetically. He was articulating a radical new vision of creation, one where divine will operated through measurable mechanics rather than mystical whims. This clockwork God idea didn't just change theology, it laid the foundation for modern science by suggesting that nature's laws could be studied like the inner workings of a tower clock. Consider the ripple effects of this analogy. If the universe ran like a precision timepiece, then its mysteries weren't arbitrary, they were puzzles waiting to be decoded. Astronomers like Johannes Kepler would later describe planetary orbits as the celestial clockmaker's design, their elliptical paths revealing mathematical harmonies no less exact than a gear train's ratios. Even the great Isaac Newton, when formulating his laws of motion, drew inspiration from clock escapements. The way they transformed chaotic energy into regulated motion mirrored his concept of a universe balanced between entropy and divine intervention. But this mechanistic worldview wasn't without controversy. Some theologians recoiled at the notion of a hands-off God who wound up creation and let it run. Theologian William of Ockham argued fiercely against what he called the heresy of the self-sufficient clock, insisting that divine providence must intervene constantly, like a clockmaker adjusting wayward gears. Yet the metaphor proved too powerful to dismiss. By the Renaissance, even the Vatican had astronomical clocks installed in its gardens, their planetary models tacitly endorsing the idea of a rationally ordered cosmos. The clock's influence extended beyond abstract philosophy. It reshaped how people conceived of their own existence. medieval illuminated manuscripts began depicting human lives as clockwork allegories, with birth, labor, and death marked like hours on a dial. The Dance of Death frescoes that swept Europe often included skeletal figures clutching hourglasses or tampering with clock mechanisms, a stark reminder that time's march spared no one. Even the concept of punctuality transformed from a vague virtue to a moral imperative. Late 16th century conduct manuals warned that tardiness was an offense against divine order, akin to disrupting the cosmic gears. Perhaps most strikingly, the clockwork metaphor blurred the line between science and spirituality in ways that still echo today. When Galileo studied pendulum motion, he wasn't just improving timekeeping, he was seeking what he called the pulse of creation. The very word mechanism, derived from the Greek for machine, became synonymous with natural processes, from the human heartbeat to the turning of tides. What began as a philosophical analogy had, by the 17th century, become a framework for understanding reality itself. One where every tick whispered that the universe, for all its grandeur, might just be comprehensible after all. Yet for all its influence, the clockwork universe had an unexpected consequence. It made time feel both more precious and more oppressive. As cities synchronized their activities to public clocks, the leisurely rhythms of agrarian life gave way to what philosopher Lewis Mumford later called the tyranny of the clock. The very device that promised to reveal divine order also became humanity's taskmaster, its relentless ticking a constant reminder of mortality in an age when life expectancy barely reached 40. The medieval clockmakers, in their quest to trap time, had unwittingly forged both a key to the cosmos and a chain for the human spirit, a paradox as intricate as the gears they so lovingly crafted. The first public clocks didn't just tell time, they rewrote the rules of society with every chime. Picture a 15th century market square where farmers once bartered goods until the sun dipped below the church steeple. Now imagine the outrage when a mechanical monster on that same steeple began dictating when stalls must open and close, its iron tongue booming across the cobblestones like a merciless overseer. For the first time in history, human activity wasn't governed by hunger, daylight, or fatigue, but by the indifferent turn of gears, and not everyone was willing to bow to this new mechanical master. Resistance flared in unexpected ways. In the textile towns of Flanders, weavers staged silent strikes, deliberately finishing their cloth after the closing bell to protest fixed work hours. Farmers' markets in southern Germany saw brawls break out when enforcers tried clearing the square at the stroke of 4. Even the clergy split. Some monks praised clocks for bringing order to prayer schedules, while others railed against the tyranny of the bell, arguing that true devotion couldn't be squeezed between mechanical chimes. The most creative dissent came from blacksmiths in York, who allegedly tampered with the town clock's weights to make lunch hours longer, sparking a 2-year game of cat and mouse with frustrated city officials. Yet the clock's greatest impact was subtler. They created a new language of power. When a feudal lord installed a clock tower overlooking his lands, its face wasn't just a timekeeper but a proclamation: "My time is your time." Merchants quickly seized on this, realizing that synchronized hours meant faster shipments and tighter contracts. The Hanseatic League, Europe's powerhouse trading network, became early adopters, using port clocks to coordinate cargo loading across a dozen cities. Suddenly, time wasn't just measured, it was commodified. A ship captain who arrived 3 bells late might face fines. A baker selling stale bread after the morning bell could lose his license. Efficiency became currency, and the clock was its mint. But the peasants and artisans pushing back weren't just being stubborn, they were defending an entire way of life. Traditional task time, where work ended when the job was done, had accommodated natural rhythms. A potter could pause to tend a sick child without watching a dial. A farmer could rest during the afternoon heat and make up the hours at dusk. The clock erased that flexibility, replacing it with what one guild manifesto called the religion of the hour, where a person's worth was measured in minutes. In some villages, folk tales sprang up about clock towers being cursed, stories of builders struck dead, or bells ringing on their own to mark the deaths of unjust rulers. The psychological shift ran even deeper. Pre-clock cultures had experienced time as cyclical seasons repeating, generations rising and falling like bread dough. The mechanical clock introduced something terrifyingly linear, time that marched forward without looping back, each tick a step closer to the grave. Art from this period shows clocks appearing in memento mori paintings, their gears interlocked with skeletons' fingers. Sermons warned parishioners that God himself might keep celestial books with hours wasted tallied against souls. Little wonder some called these devices devil's abacuses. Yet for all the fear and friction, the public clock's triumph was inevitable, not because it was perfect, but because it solved a problem growing louder with each passing decade: how to make a crowded world run smoothly. As cities swelled with migrants and markets expanded across continents, the old ways of timing life became impossible. The clock didn't just impose order, it enabled complexity, letting ships coordinate across oceans and letting cities of strangers function like synchronized organisms. What's fascinating is how quickly the rebels adapted. Within a generation, the same weavers who'd smashed clock faces were demanding overtime pay for extra turns of the wheel. Farmers learned to plant by both the moon and the market bell, hedging their bets between tradition and progress. Even the clergy compromised. The famous Glastonbury clock, installed in 1525, featured biblical scenes that advanced with the hours, blending mechanical precision with sacred storytelling. The true legacy of these early public clocks isn't just in the minutes they measured, but in the paradox they revealed: that humans could both resent time's new masters and become helplessly dependent on them. Those iron giants in their towers didn't just tell time, they taught us how to live in a world where time tells us. And that lesson, for better or worse, still ticks in every alarm clock, every timesheet, and every hurried glance at a smartphone today. At the heart of Strasbourg Cathedral, a mechanical rooster flaps its gilded wings, crows 3 times, and pivots to face the 12 apostles parading past, a spectacle designed not just to tell time, but to make the divine tangible. These automata weren't mere decorations. They were medieval clockmakers' most audacious attempt to breathe life into the cold precision of gears. When a lion roared from the face of a prog clock, or a wooden St. George charged at the dragon in Lübeck's town square, viewers didn't just see machinery, they witnessed miracles in motion. The brilliance of these creations lay in their dual purpose. On one level, they served as mnemonic devices for illiterate populations. A farmer might not read Latin numerals, but when the mechanical Virgin Mary raised her arms at noon, he knew it was time for midday prayers. The automata acted as living almanacs too. The bear clutching a honeycomb in the Olomouc clock signaled the start of beekeeping season, while a grape-treading figure in Burgundy's wine country marked harvest deadlines. These weren't just whimsical touches, they were the medieval equivalent of push notifications, translating abstract hours into visceral, culturally resonant moments. Yet their deeper function was philosophical. By making celestial concepts physical planets represented by rotating figurines, the resurrection enacted by a rising Christ, automaton clockmakers transformed theology into theater. The Strasbourg clock's procession of death striking the hour while the apostles marched past wasn't just a show. It was a mechanical memento mori, reminding viewers that even as time devoured all things, salvation followed a predictable schedule. This blending of sacred and mechanical imagery comforted a population grappling with the Black Death's chaos. If even eternity could be mechanized, perhaps there was order behind the universe's cruelty. The engineering behind these marvels bordered on sorcery. Consider the Rostock clock's Dance of Death sequence. As the hour struck, a skeleton played chess against a living king while other figures passed through a miniature cemetery. This required concentric brass rings with precisely staggered cam lifts, each activating its figure at the correct moment, all crafted with hand-forged precision centuries before computer animation. The clockmaker who designed it reportedly studied puppet theaters and cathedral bell ropes for inspiration, merging carnival spectacle with ecclesiastical grandeur. Not all automata carried such weighty symbolism. Some clockmakers indulged pure whimsy, like the Augsburg timepiece featuring drunken monks whose beer steins lifted in sync with the hours, or the Nuremberg hen that laid a brass egg at midnight. These comic relief elements revealed clockmakers' playful side, a reminder that even in an era of plagues and inquisitions, engineers still carved out space for joy. The hen's mechanism, with its concealed spring-loaded egg chamber, became so famous that wealthy collectors commissioned standalone versions, creating Europe's first luxury novelty clocks. The automata craze peaked with the Renaissance, but its legacy ticked on. Leonardo da Vinci's lion automaton for Francis I borrowed directly from clockwork apostles. The gears that powered cathedral angels later drove the first industrial looms, and that Strasbourg rooster, its descendant, crowed aboard the Wright brothers' first airplane, proving that humanity's oldest mechanical dreams could still take flight. These weren't just clock decorations, they were the first sparks of robotics, artificial intelligence, and all our modern attempts to make machines feel alive. The medieval clockmakers didn't just want to measure time, they wanted to make it sing, dance, and occasionally lay golden eggs. The world of medieval clockmaking was far from the quiet, studious pursuit we might imagine. It was a cutthroat arena where craftsmen guarded their secrets like dragon hordes, and sabotage was as common as sawdust on the workshop floor. Take the infamous feud between Jan van Eyck, not the painter but his lesser-known clockmaker cousin, and Henry de Vic in 14th century Bruges. When de Vic unveiled a revolutionary weight-driven mechanism, Van Eyck retaliated by hiring street urchins to throw rotten eggs at the tower during its inaugural chime. The ensuing brawl between their apprentices became so violent the town council banned both men from working within the city walls for a year. Yet this petty rivalry birthed a genuine breakthrough. Van Eyck's subsequent floating escapement, designed to outshine his rival, became the precursor to modern pendulum systems. Nor were these battles confined to back alleys. In Renaissance Florence, the race to build the most extravagant palace clock escalated into full-blown espionage. Lorenzo della Volpea, creator of the famed planetary clock for Lorenzo de' Medici, once disguised himself as a monk to infiltrate a rival's workshop, only to be caught red-handed sketching gear designs in the margins of a stolen psalm book. The resulting scandal saw both clockmakers summoned before the Signoria, where they were forced to publicly reconcile, though Della Volpea's journals later revealed he'd paid the judge to rule in his favor. The stakes grew even higher when guilds entered the fray. The London Clockmakers Guild maintained a black book of disgraced members, including one Thomas Glover, who in 1522 was caught deliberately misaligning the gears in a competitor's tower clock. His punishment, being forced to wear a miniature broken clock around his neck for a year while repairing timepieces for free. Yet for every act of sabotage, there were flashes of unexpected collaboration. After years of bitter competition, German masters Peter Henlein and Jacob Zech secretly pooled their knowledge to develop the first portable watch springs, a partnership only revealed when a joint prayer book surfaced centuries later, its margins crammed with shared diagrams in identical ink. Some rivalries turned deadly. The Strasbourg clockmaker Isaac Habrecht barely survived an accidental fall from a scaffold in 1589, an event contemporaries linked to his public mockery of a rival's faulty lunar calendar mechanism. Meanwhile, in Prague, the legendary Hanush, credited with the astronomical clock, was allegedly blinded by city councillors to prevent him recreating his masterpiece elsewhere, though recent evidence suggests this may have been cover for a botched assassination by a jealous Hungarian horologist. What fueled this relentless competition wasn't just pride or profit. It was the dawning realization that timekeeping was becoming the defining technology of the age. A master clockmaker could demand privileges normally reserved for nobility, tax exemptions, private armed guards, even the right to bear coats of arms. When Charles V ennobled his personal horologist Juanilo Turriano in 1540, it sparked a wave of copycat patents across Europe as rulers scrambled to secure their own time rights. The message was clear: in an era when accurate clocks meant military advantage, trade dominance, and social control, the artisans who built them held uncommon power. Yet for all the drama, these feuds accelerated progress at a dizzying pace. The same secrecy that led to poisoned rivalries also forced isolated innovations, like when Augsburg's Christoph Margraf, denied access to guild techniques, invented the Stackfried regulator out of sheer desperation. The astronomical clock arms race between Nuremberg and Ulm produced horological masterpieces packed with features neither city could have achieved alone. Even the sabotage backfired spectacularly at times after a rival's acid damaged his clock faces. Lyon's Pierre Favrier developed enamel coatings so durable they're still studied by materials scientists today. The ultimate irony, these bitter competitors became unwitting collaborators in a grander project. Each stolen sketch, each sabotaged prototype, each courtroom confrontation inadvertently cross-pollinated ideas across Europe. By the time the pendulum clock emerged in the 17th century, it wasn't the work of a single genius, but the distilled product of centuries of rivalry, theft, and one-upmanship proof that even the most cutthroat competition could keep horology's gears turning forward. The doomsday clock was never just a timekeeper. It was a ticking omen, its hands creeping toward midnight as though dragged by some unseen cosmic dread. In the shadowed workshops of 15th century Europe, a handful of clockmakers claimed their creations could predict the end of days, their gears synchronized to biblical prophecies or the slow dance of rogue planets. The most infamous, the so-called Clock of Antichrist in Vienna, featured a dial where the 12th hour was engraved with a skeletal figure swallowing the sun. Its maker, a reclusive monk named Brother Gerhard, swore its inner wheels mirrored the Book of Revelation's timeline, each eclipse calculation and planetary conjunction pulling the minute hand closer to oblivion. What's startling isn't just the audacity of these claims, but how seriously they were taken. When the Nuremberg clockmaker Hans Pfalz installed a Judgment Day mechanism in the city's main square, its chime triggering a parade of wooden angels blowing trumpets, the town council paid him double to remove it after panicked citizens reported nightmares. Even rational minds weren't immune. The astronomer Johann Stoeffler predicted a cataclysmic planetary alignment for 1524, inspiring a wave of doomsday clocks across Germany, their gears calibrated to his calculations. When the date passed uneventfully, the devices were quietly repurposed, their apocalyptic markings filed away like embarrassing diary entries. Yet these clocks weren't just fear-mongering, they were mirrors of an age where catastrophe felt imminent. The Black Death had shown how swiftly the world could unravel. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 seemed to fulfill prophecies of Christian collapse. Against this backdrop, a clock that quantified doom offered perverse comfort. If the end could be measured, perhaps it could also be delayed. Some doomsday clocks even included redemption gears, extra mechanisms that, when activated by charitable acts or prayers, supposedly pushed the apocalyptic hand backward. The message was clear: time might be a countdown, but humanity still had agency. The mechanics behind these devices reveal their creators' twisted ingenuity. The Great Computer's clock in Prague used a complex array of concentric rings to track not just hours, but jubilee cycles from the Old Testament, its central pinion allegedly slipping whenever war or plague approached. Another, hidden in a Spanish monastery, synchronized its movements with the 70 weeks of Daniel's prophecy. Its maker convinced the final gear would jam at the second coming. Modern horologists examining these mechanisms note how their errors compounded over time: a miscalibrated gear here, a misaligned astrolabe there, until the machines essentially became self-fulfilling prophecies, their inevitable breakdowns interpreted as divine warnings. The line between science and superstition blurred shamelessly. Many doomsday clockmakers were also respected mathematicians, their apocalyptic predictions based on legitimate astronomical observations. When Regiomontanus predicted the world would end in 1588 based on lunar cycles, his followers built clocks that factored in not just planetary motion, but comets, blood moons, and even the mystical Great Year of ancient Babylon. These weren't cranks. They were scholars trying to reconcile cutting-edge science with a universe they still believed operated on divine principles. Their clocks became physical equations, attempting to solve for the unknown variable of God's wrath. By the 17th century, the doomsday clock craze had wound down, but its legacy persisted. The famous Shepherd Gate clock at Greenwich, though designed for nautical precision, retained a hidden apocalyptic feature. Its second hand would vibrate ominously during solar storms, a nod to older beliefs that celestial disturbances heralded the end. Even today, the symbolic doomsday clock maintained by atomic scientists echoes its medieval ancestors, trading astrological alignments for nuclear threat levels, but still speaking to that same human urge to quantify the unquantifiable. The lesson of these forgotten machines isn't just about misplaced faith in technology. It's about how even our tools for measuring time can't escape the fears of the people who build them. Every clock, it seems, holds a mirror to the era that created it, and sometimes that reflection is screaming. Sailing into uncharted waters with nothing but the stars as guides, medieval explorers faced a problem more daunting than sea monsters or mutiny. They couldn't tell where they were. The open ocean swallowed all landmarks, leaving ships adrift in a featureless blue expanse where a single degree of miscalculation could mean missing an island by hundreds of miles. Latitude could be gauged by the sun's angle, but longitude, that required knowing exactly what time it was back home, a feat impossible with clocks that lost or gained hours each day. The age of exploration wasn't delayed by lack of courage or ships, but by something far more mundane. Medieval timekeeping simply wasn't good enough. Early marine clocks were little more than landlubber mechanisms crammed into wooden boxes, doomed to fail the moment they hit rough seas. Moisture warped their gears. Salt air corroded their springs. Temperature swings made them run fast in tropical heat and sluggish in Arctic cold. The infamous Neff clocks, miniature tower clocks mounted on gimbals, were supposed to stay level in choppy waters, but sailors joked they told better time when upside down. Portuguese navigators venturing down Africa's coast in the 1400s often carried multiple timepieces, averaging their erratic readings in desperate hope of accuracy. One captain's log from 1487 records the frustration. Our clocks disagree by 7 hours, yet God himself has only 6 to create the world. The consequences were deadly serious. Without precise longitude measurements, ships piled onto reefs or vanished into the Atlantic's void. Columbus's first voyage nearly ended in mutiny when his crew realized his timekeeping errors had them lost west of the Azores. Magellan's circumnavigation succeeded despite his chronometers, not because of them. His fleet's surviving logbooks show wild longitude guesses that would have doomed less fortunate sailors. The problem became so notorious that Spain's Philip II offered a king's ransom to anyone who could solve it, sparking a frenzy of failed inventions. One particularly harebrained scheme involved wounded dogs on every ship. The theory was they'd howl in unison when their home port clocks struck noon. What's often overlooked is how these failures shaped history's timeline. Portugal's early dominance in exploration came partly from bypassing clocks altogether, using painstaking, dead reckoning with hourglasses and star charts. Meanwhile, England's late entry into global voyages wasn't just about ship technology. It was because Tudor clockmakers were still struggling to stabilize basic tower mechanisms, let alone seaworthy ones. The spice routes, the New World colonies, even the slave trade's geography were all influenced by whose clocks could survive a tropical storm. Yet within these disasters lay the seeds of eventual triumph. Every salt-crusted wreck of a marine clock taught hard lessons about balance springs and temperature compensation. The very errors that drove navigators mad like a clock speeding up near the equator, clued in later makers like John Harrison that metals expanded with heat. Even the doomed nocturnal dials, attempting to track time by the moon's position, hinted at the celestial mechanical hybrids that would eventually solve the longitude problem. The cruelest irony, medieval clockmakers had unknowingly built the solution centuries before it was needed. The sophisticated verge escapements in monastic clocks, designed to withstand Northern Europe's freezing winters, contained principles perfect for marine chronometers, if anyone had thought to miniaturize them. Instead, the age of exploration unfolded like a grand play where the lead actor kept missing cues, forced to improvise while waiting for the prop that would make the whole production run smoothly. And when that prop finally arrived in the 1700s, it wouldn't be a radical invention, just the distilled wisdom of all those broken clocks that came before. Their failures finally turned into something seaworthy. The mad clockmakers of the Middle Ages died believing they had failed. Their tower clocks still lost minutes each day. Their perpetual motion dreams remained stubbornly impossible. Their doomsday predictions never came to pass. Yet in their glorious, misguided pursuit of trapping time, they accidentally built the scaffolding of modernity itself. Those clunky, erratic machines were more than just inventions. They were the first physical manifestations of a radical idea, that the universe operates by predictable, measurable rules. When Galileo dropped his weights from the Leaning Tower of Pisa or Newton calculated the moon's orbit, they weren't just doing science, they were thinking like clockmakers, seeing the cosmos as one vast, interlocking mechanism. Consider the real legacy of these tinkerers. It wasn't just the gears they left behind, but the very language of progress. The word clockwork became synonymous with precision because medieval artisans proved even flawed machines could mirror celestial order. The scientific method itself owes these craftsmen an unspoken debt. Their endless trial and error approach to escapements and counterweights established the value of iterative experimentation centuries before Francis Bacon formalized it. Even their wildest failures taught essential lessons. The mercury-filled, eternal motion clocks that gummed up after 3 days. They demonstrated the inevitability of entropy long before thermodynamics had a name. Modern innovators could learn volumes from their stubborn brilliance. Today's tech culture worships fail-fast mantras, but medieval clockmakers embodied a deeper truth. Some problems demand slow, obsessive devotion. Peter Henlein spent 40 years perfecting his pocket watch springs. Giovanni da Dondi's celestial clock required 16,000 precisely angled gear teeth, each filed by hand. These weren't quick pivots or minimum viable products, they were lifetime commitments to impossible problems. There's a lesson here for our age of disposable apps and planned obsolescence. Breakthrough inventions often come from loving a problem more than the solution. The clockmakers' greatest gift was their tolerance for productive delusion. They chased perpetual motion knowing it couldn't exist, built astronomical displays with laughably inaccurate medieval star charts, and kept improving tower clocks that still drifted by hours. Why? Because aiming for perfection, even unattainable perfection, forced them to stumble upon practical advances. That same spirit lives in today's quantum computing labs and fusion reactors, where scientists pursue impossible goals knowing the pursuit itself will yield unexpected breakthroughs. The Strasbourg clock's faulty lunar calendar didn't just tell time poorly, it inspired later astronomers to develop more accurate ephemeris tables. Perhaps their most surprising legacy is how they redefined human potential. Before clock towers, most people experienced time as something that happened to them. The sun rose, crops grew, seasons turned. Afterward, time became something humans could partition, control, even sell. This mental shift made possible everything from railway schedules to stock market openings. When medieval guilds fined members for wasting hours, they weren't just being punitive, they were planting the seed of modern productivity culture. The clockmakers didn't just invent machines, they invented the very concept of efficiency. Yet for all their influence, these artisans would scarcely recognize our world of atomic precision and digital nanoseconds. The average smartphone now keeps time better than all but the most advanced Renaissance clocks, and it does so as a background process, no winding, no adjustments, no tower required. But that ease comes at a cost. We've gained unimaginable accuracy while losing something the medieval craftsmen would find incomprehensible: the visceral connection between time and human effort. When every device automatically syncs to the world clock, we forget that synchrony was once a hard-won marvel, paid for in broken gears and sleepless nights. The true lesson of these mad clockmakers isn't in their mechanisms, but in their mindset. They looked at the most abstract, intangible force governing human existence and dared to ask, what if we could hold it in our hands? That same audacity fuels today's pioneers chasing AI consciousness, Mars colonization, and quantum leaps we can't yet imagine. Like their medieval counterparts, many will fail. Some will be ridiculed, a few might change everything because history shows us clearly the line between madness and genius isn't who succeeds, but who refuses to stop trying. So the next time you check your watch or glance at a phone clock, take a second to hear the echo of those ancient workshops. Behind every digital readout ticks 5 centuries of stubbornness, ingenuity, and wild-eyed dreams, proof that sometimes the most revolutionary ideas begin as broken gears in a forgotten tower, waiting for the right mind to assemble them into something extraordinary. Geoffrey Chaucer's pilgrims in the Canterbury Tales didn't just travel by sunlight, they moved to the rhythm of clock bells, their journey punctuated by the mechanical heartbeat of a new age. This wasn't just background detail, it was a literary revolution. For the first time in Western literature, time wasn't a vague natural force but a precise, human-made actor in the story. Chaucer's clock, mentioned casually in the Nun's Priest's Tale, marked more than the hour. It signaled a cultural shift where timekeeping began shaping how people imagined their own lives. Artists and writers seized on this, turning clocks into potent symbols that whispered of mortality, ambition, and the uneasy dance between human control and cosmic inevitability. Medieval illuminated manuscripts tell the same story in vivid pigments. A 15th century Book of Hours might depict the Virgin Mary cradling Christ, while a miniature clock tower looms in the background, its hands frozen at the hour of the crucifixion. These weren't decorative flourishes, they were theological statements. By placing clocks in sacred scenes, artists suggested even divinity operated within measurable time, a radical idea when eternity was supposed to transcend human construct. The famous Tres Riches Jures du Dr. Berry takes this further, pairing agricultural labors with zodiac signs and clock faces, binding heavenly cycles, earthly toil, and mechanical precision into a single visual hymn. Then there were the macabre depictions. Hans Holbein's The Ambassadors hides a distorted skull in its foreground, but look closer. The upper shelf displays a precision cylinder clock, its exposed gears mirroring the skull's hollow sockets. The message was unmistakable. Time's machinery and mortality were two sides of the same coin. Dance of Death frescoes across Europe reinforced this, showing skeletons winding clock hands or smashing hourglasses as they claimed victims. In Basel's cathedral, a particularly gruesome mural featured death adjusting a clock's escapement while a king pleaded for more time, the gear teeth resembling a predator's bared fangs. Yet clocks also symbolized hope. Leonardo da Vinci's notebooks overflow with clock designs, their mechanisms blending art and engineering in a way that hinted at his boundless curiosity. His unfinished Last Supper reportedly included a hidden clock motif. Some scholars argue the disciples' hands form an implicit sundial, with Christ as the gnomon casting the shadow of impending sacrifice. Even Dante's Divine Comedy, written decades before mechanical clocks spread, described paradise as a celestial orrery, its souls moving in divinely synchronized orbits. By the Renaissance, this duality was everywhere. Clocks represented both human ingenuity's triumph and its hubris, our attempt to cage the uncageable. Theatre embraced these contradictions too. In mystery plays performed on cathedral steps, the character of Temperance often carried a miniature clock, her steady rhythm contrasting with the chaotic, vice figures who smashed hourglasses. Shakespeare later riffed on this in Henry Roman IV, where Prince Hal laments time's foolish, dangling minutes, only to later embody clock-like discipline as king. The metaphor had teeth. Audiences understood that mastering time wasn't just about mechanics, but morality. What's fascinating is how these artistic depictions fed back into real-world clockmaking. When the Strasbourg clock was rebuilt in the 1500s, its automata included not just the usual apostles, but a parade of figures from classical mythology, a direct nod to the humanist movement in art. Clockmakers became self-conscious artists, engraving mottos like Tempus Fugit on dials or hiding miniature vanitas paintings behind clock faces. The message was clear: their craft wasn't just functional, it was philosophical. By the late Middle Ages, the clock had become a cultural shorthand so potent it transcended language. In a Prague altarpiece, a golden clock sits at the Virgin's feet, its hands pointing to midnight, an allusion to the hour of darkness in gospel narratives. Dutch still lifes placed watches beside rotting fruit, their gears gleaming as the peaches spoiled. Even musical notation absorbed the imagery. The horologium section of 14th century motets used repeating rhythmic patterns to mimic clockwork regularity. This cultural saturation did something profound. It made abstract time feel personal. when peasants saw death holding a clock in a church mural, or merchants read about lovers parting at the stroke of 4 in a romance, timekeeping ceased to be just a technology. It became a mirror for human hopes and fears, a way to ask the oldest questions in new terms. If a clock could measure a life's hours, did that mean life was just another mechanism? Or did the clock's ceaseless motion hint at something transcendent, proof that humans could touch the edges of eternity with nothing but gears and grit? The answer, like a medieval clock's chime, resounded through art long after its makers were dust. Every Vanitas painting, every poetic reference to time's winged chariot, every cathedral automaton jerking to life carried forward the same idea those first clockmakers had engraved in brass, that time was no longer just something we inhabit, but something we debate, we depict, we defy. And in that defiance, art and machinery became unlikely allies, one capturing time's meaning, the other its measure, both insisting that even if we can't stop the clock, we can still make it tell our story. The clang of a hammer striking red-hot iron echoes through a 21st century workshop, but the hands shaping the metal aren't crafting some sleek modern device, they're resurrecting a 700-year-old clock, one painstaking tap at a time. Across Europe and America, a quiet revolution is underway as teams of blacksmiths, historians, and engineers collaborate to rebuild medieval timepieces using only the tools and techniques available to their original makers. These aren't replicas or approximations, they're forensic reconstructions where every gear tooth is filed by hand, every brass casting poured into handmade molds, every wooden frame carved with period-accurate adzes. And what they're revealing turns much of what we thought we knew about medieval technology on its head. Take the great clock of Wells Cathedral, reconstructed over a decade by a team from the British Horological Institute. When they dismantled the surviving 1430 mechanism, they discovered something astonishing. The original clockmakers had engineered a primitive but effective shock absorption system using leather pads between the gears, a feature absent from later Renaissance clocks. Even more remarkably, the clock's famous jousting knights, long assumed to be purely decorative, actually served as a mechanical fail-safe. If the main drivetrain jammed, the knight's momentum would trigger a secondary gear train to keep time until repairs could be made. This wasn't just art, it was medieval redundancy engineering at its finest. Meanwhile, in the Czech Republic, horologist Petr Skola's reconstruction of the Prague astronomical clock uncovered secrets hidden in plain sight. The famous zodiac ring, long thought to be merely symbolic, contains precise angular measurements that match 13th century Alphonsine tables, proving the clock could predict planetary positions with startling accuracy despite its creators lacking telescopes or calculus. Even the clock's seemingly erratic performance in modern times has an explanation. Skola discovered the original builders calibrated its gears to the slightly irregular temporal hours used in medieval Prague, where daylight was divided into 12 equal parts regardless of season. What appeared to be inaccuracy was actually precision, just precision tuned to a forgotten rhythm. Perhaps the most humbling revelation comes from the materials themselves. Modern engineers attempting to recreate the metal alloys used in medieval clocks repeatedly hit a wall. Their components wore out far faster than the originals. The breakthrough came when a German metallurgist analyzed filings from a 14th century Strasbourg clock gear. The metal contained microscopic traces of organic material, beech, wood ash from the smelting process that, by sheer accident, created a self-lubricating carbon nanostructure within the brass. This wasn't sophisticated material science, it was alchemical serendipity, a happy accident medieval artisans couldn't have understood but learned to exploit through trial and error. The reconstructions also expose the blind spots in our modern assumptions. When Cambridge University's History of Science department built a working replica of Richard of Wallingford's 1430 cent. Albans clock, they assumed its famed astronomical displays would require complex gear trains. Instead, they found the medieval designer had employed ingeniously simple epicyclic gears, the same principle governing children's spirograph toys, to model planetary retrograde motion. "We were looking for Ptolemaic complexity," admitted project lead Dr. Elena Wilson, but the real brilliance lay in their restraint. These projects aren't just academic exercises. At the Musée de Cluny in Paris, visitors can now hear the resonant chime of a reconstructed 1400s monastic clock, its sound waves matching vibration patterns found in the monastery's original stone walls, proof the builders designed both clock and architecture as a unified acoustic system. In Nuremberg, craftsmen using medieval techniques recently completed a fully functional Nuremberg egg portable clock, revealing that early watchmakers achieved surprising accuracy by repurposing jewelers' tools to create microscopic pivot bearings. What emerges from these reconstructions is a portrait of medieval clockmakers as both more pragmatic and more visionary than we imagined. They weren't just copying classical knowledge or groping toward modernity. They were solving problems with whatever materials and mathematics they had, often arriving at solutions that would be rediscovered centuries later. Their clocks weren't primitive ancestors of ours. They were parallel achievements, born from a worldview that saw no divide between sacred geometry and practical mechanics. As we file their forgotten gears back into existence, we're not just learning how they kept time, we're rediscovering how they thought, how they dreamed, and how they touched the face of eternity with nothing but fire, faith, and forged iron. Behind the gleaming brass faces of medieval clocks, some whisper, lie secrets more intricate than the gears themselves. The Wells Cathedral clock, with its whimsical jousting knights, reportedly concealed a tiny compartment behind its moon-phased dial, a space just large enough to hold a single folded parchment. When restorers opened it in 1967, they found nothing but dust, but the discovery sparked a tantalizing question. Had someone, centuries earlier, slipped out a message meant to outlast empires? This wasn't an isolated case. The Antwerp astrolabe clock, crafted in 1522, contained a hollow weight filled with mercury, a feature with no clear mechanical purpose, until a 21st century X-ray revealed minuscule etchings along the inner walls. Deciphered as musical notation, the markings turned out to be a fragment of a lost Gregorian chant, its lyrics referencing the hour of revelation. Was it a craftsman's private devotion or a clue meant for future eyes? Even the Strasbourg clock's famous rooster hides a peculiar detail. Its beak opens precisely 3 times at noon, yet historical accounts insist the original design called for 4, a discrepancy some theorize was deliberate, a silent protest against the city council's interference encoded in missed motions. The most compelling evidence lies in the clocks themselves. Many medieval timepieces feature gear ratios that serve no obvious timekeeping function. The Prague astronomical clock's central wheel, for instance, completes a full rotation every 27 1/3 days, a period matching neither lunar nor solar cycles. But when compared to medieval alchemical texts, that number appears repeatedly as the supposed duration for the great work of transmuting base metals into gold. Coincidence, or was the clock's creator, Master Hanush, embedding esoteric knowledge into the machine's very bones? Then there are the anomalies that defy explanation. In 1984, a conservator cleaning the Lübeck Marienkirche clock discovered a hidden sub-dial behind the main face, its hands frozen at 3:18. Local archives revealed that on March 18, 1587, the clockmaker's apprentice had fallen to his death during maintenance, a tragedy some believe the master commemorated in this clandestine memorial. Other clocks bear cryptic engravings, the initials DS, repeated in gear teeth patterns, or Latin phrases like tempus occultum, hidden time, etched where only a disassembler would see them. Historians remain divided. Skeptics argue these are nothing more than artisans' signatures or workshop inside jokes. But the sheer consistency of the quirks across regions, centuries, and guilds suggests something more deliberate. Perhaps in an age when heretical ideas could mean execution, clockmakers used their creations as vaults, safeguarding forbidden knowledge in the one place authority would never think to look, inside the very machines that measured their control. The irony is exquisite. While kings and popes used public clocks to impose order, the craftsmen who built them may have woven threads of rebellion into the gears, messages in metal waiting centuries for someone to read them. And if that's true, then the greatest secret these clocks keep isn't in their hidden compartments or cryptic engravings, but in the quiet subversion of their existence, that even in a world obsessed with measuring time, some truths were meant to outlast it. The mad clockmakers of the Middle Ages may not have trapped time, but they forever changed how we perceive it. Their failures were as important as their successes, proving that progress is born from daring to dream the impossible. As we glance at our watches today, let's remember these pioneers who turned the chaotic flow of time into something we could measure, master, and for a fleeting moment control. What will future generations say about our own quests to conquer time? Share your thoughts below, and don't forget to subscribe for more journeys into history's hidden corners. Look around you. Every clock, every timer, every digital readout is a direct descendant of those clunky, erratic medieval contraptions. The smartphone in your pocket, the atomic clocks synchronizing global finance, even the countdowns on space rockets, they all trace their lineage back to those workshops where monks and blacksmiths wrestled with gears by candlelight. The irony is delicious. The very devices we now take for granted were once considered as outlandish as time machines. These clockmakers didn't just invent mechanisms, they invented a new way of thinking. Before their towers rose over city squares, time was something that happened to people. Afterward, it became something people could manipulate, debate, even sell. The shift was so profound it altered language itself. Words like punctual and clockwise entered common speech, while phrases like out of time took on existential weight. The clock didn't just measure hours, it reshaped human consciousness, turning abstract eternity into countable minutes. Yet for all their genius, these artisans would likely be baffled by our modern obsession with precision. A medieval clock that lost only 15 minutes a day was a marvel. Today, we grumble if our watches drift by seconds. In chasing perfection, we've gained unimaginable accuracy but lost something those early makers understood: that time isn't just a number, but a rhythm, a story, a shared experience. Their clocks weren't silent dictators, they were conversation starters, their bells sparking debates about work, faith, and the nature of existence itself. So the next time you check the time, pause for a heartbeat. Consider the centuries of toil, the broken gears, the blind alleys, and the flashes of inspiration that made that casual glance possible. And ask yourself, if those clockmakers could see us now, would they marvel at our atomic precision, or pity us for forgetting that time's true magic lies not in counting it, but in how we choose to live it? The quest to conquer time isn't over, it's just ticking louder than ever.